Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Yasmin Vafa, Executive Director of Rights4Girls, and we are one of the proud co-sponsors of today's conversation on feminism, critical race theory, and sexual exploitation, part of an ongoing virtual series that we are thrilled to be co-presenting with our friends at Repair around unpacking and discussing some of the emerging issues around sexual exploitation and trafficking across the country. I just want to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us. And I quickly want to turn it over to my colleague Beth to offer our land recognition.
Thank you, Yasmin, and thank you everyone for joining us. Repair would like to acknowledge the Gabrielina Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tulangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and South Channel Islands. And we are very grateful to have the opportunity to work with the Turelhatum, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukvatam, the ancestors, Ahihiram, the elders, and Eohimkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging.
Thank you so much, Beth. And thank you for joining us for today's conversation, one that I think is incredibly timely as we are seeing all across the country. We are exploring themes around critical race theory and its importance to understanding not just our history here in the United States, but understanding and navigating many of the circumstances that impact our laws, our institutions, and the daily lives of so many of us here in the United States. But even with the talks of critical race theory, I know that many feminists feel like there is still a big push to ensure that the impact on women and girls of color in particular is not overlooked. Many of us who are advocates and allies in the movement and sexual exploitation and trafficking also feel that critical race analysis and lens is essential to understanding our history and origins, particularly of the commercial sex trade here in the United States, the impact of colonization, the transatlantic slave trade, and how it really helps to inform all that we see today. So we're very excited to be able to explore some of these themes in our conversation with three extraordinary panelists that we are thrilled to have with us. It's my privilege to introduce you to Taina Bien-Aimé, who has close to 3 decades of experience advocating for the rights of women and girls across the globe. She is currently the executive director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, which is one of the oldest international organizations dedicated to combating trafficking against women and girls across the globe. She is an expert on sexual exploitation and trafficking law and policy, and we are thrilled to have her with us today. Next, we have Sherene Razack, who is the Distinguished Professor and the Penny Canner Endowed Chair in Women's Studies at the Department of Gender Studies at UCLA. Her research and teachings focus on racial violence, and she is actually the founder of a virtual research and training network called Racial Violence Hub. Sherene's areas of focus include issues such as race, gender, disposability, anti-Muslim racism, imperialism, torture and terror, sexual violence, interlocking systems of oppression, and critical race feminism. She's also the author of numerous books and articles, and so we're thrilled to have her with us today as well. And last but certainly not least, we are honored to have with us Melanie Thompson, who's a youth outreach coordinator with the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. Melanie is a renowned speaker, activist, and leader in the global fight to end sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. She is a survivor of trafficking and prostitution, and she is also a survivor of the foster care system as well as the criminal legal system. And she became an activist starting at age 14, and she's since testified across the world in front of various legislatures about the need to pass strong and effective anti-trafficking laws, as well as ending the arrest and criminalization of trafficked and prostituted peoples. She's currently a student at Hunter College. So I just want to thank all of our panelists again for joining us. And just to kick things off, I'd really love to hear from each of you what it is that draws you and brings you to this work, and why is it so important to be talking about these issues today? So if we can start with you, Taina.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Repair. Thank you, Yasmin, and everybody who joined us for this conversation. I'm looking forward to it. So what brings me, I think in my case, it's almost organic. I'm the first generation of Haitian immigrants. I was born here in New York City. My grandmother was a suffragette in Haiti. From the time I was 5 years old, my mother made it very clear that it was important for her daughters to have an education that, until I was 12, I thought I lived in a matriarchal society because everything happened around the kitchen table, and I was surrounded by women all the time who made the decisions, who yelled at their husbands, controlled everything. And then as you start to decipher what happens around that kitchen table, who's getting harassed at work, who's getting beaten at home, who has gotten raped, etc. That's when sort of my sense of what women and girls' position in the world really were, that the matriarchs whom I love so much actually only had power, so to speak, in the house, political power, that once they left it, they weren't even considered humans. My mother would say that they would call them coconuts at work, because they were from the Caribbean. And so it was made very, very clear to me that I came from a very long line of women warriors. They gave me my name for a reason from the Taino Indians. And so I think I didn't have a choice in the matter, but to continue the work that has been done for centuries before me. And I'm very honored to do my very modest part to continue the struggle. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Taina. Sherene, would you mind going next?
Thanks, Yasmin. Well, from the beginning of my academic career, which is a long time ago, like 3 decades ago, I have always been driven to understand how race, class, gender, and sexuality really operate through each other to produce people who are considered disposable, persons who are by and large against whom violence is authorized. So in trying to think about racial violence from the very beginning, that's been something that I was very drawn to right from the beginning for some related reasons to stuff that Taina mentions, one's position in the world, one's family, one's history. Academically, sort of trying to look at that and trying to think about the fact that violence is so authorized and so okay against various groups of people, I knew that the answer had to lie with how all of these systems are operating at once. And so what really brings me to this is an academic and a political and a personal sort of drive to understand the violence, to understand how it comes to be that it is so authorized. And of course, that desire is completely linked to wanting to work to end it. So that's what brings me to it. And academically, really, what happened sort of very early on in my career, the early 90s, was that once you started to think about prostitution and about the tremendous violence in it, you quickly realized that the academy had a kind of dominant answer to this, which is to think of it in a certain way. And so I think that's really what brings me here today, is that some of the troubles analytically and politically from 30 years ago are still here with us today. And it's this need to keep trying to understand it and to respond to sort of anxieties that I have as an academic, that I'm somehow deeply complicitous in the violence. by virtue of the things that I participate in. So that's what really brings me here today, and I'll leave it at that, and can talk more later about this academic journey that seems to be going round and round in circles, not really changing.
Thank you so much, Sherene. Melanie, can you please go next?
Yes, absolutely. So as you mentioned, Yasmin, for me, this is very personal. So being a survivor of sex trafficking has really put an entirely different perspective on the way that I view life today. And I remember shortly after my exiting the life, as I call it, I remember not wanting anything to do with the sex trade at all, whether it be court, whether it be advocacy, activism. I didn't want to talk to anybody. But as the years went on, I found myself being an advocate naturally in personal spaces, having friends that would make ignorant remarks or teachers that would say things that I found incorrect. That's something that I've seen being in the life. What I realized is that when you are trafficked and when you are exploited, you usually don't have a voice, for lack of a better term. There's somebody that's pulling the strings above your head. And I think for me, coming to this work was my way of finding my own voice. And as Sherene mentioned, I mean, I wasn't on the earth 30 years, but in my lifetime, I have seen continuously that regardless of how much work I feel that we as a group and advocates do, there's still so much more work to be done and so much more education that needs to be spread. So for me, that's what brings me to this work, and that's what keeps me in this work.
Thank you so much, Mel, and thanks to all of you again for being with us for this conversation. I think, Sherene and Melanie, you both kind of touched on this issue, and we are obviously seeing a lot of resistance and pushback across the country to concepts such as critical race theory, often by those who have an interest in not examining or continuing to ignore the role of our laws, our institutions, in perpetuating and sustaining systems of oppression, white supremacy. However, we've seen more of an openness in academia to these concepts and really seen it flourish within academia and be viewed as a means to achieve racial justice. However, that tendency hasn't always included an explicit feminist lens, and almost always seems to stop short of critiquing or incorporating a lens towards sexual exploitation and trafficking. And so I wonder if each of you can share a little bit about what has been your experience with academia and its role when it comes to these issues. And any one of you can feel free to go first.
But I don't know if I really should go first at this point, since I feel entirely complicit in it. So
I can start. So for me, I've had personally a very negative experience in my academic career thus far when it comes to approaching both the issues of race and separately the issues of the sex trade and prostitution. And I'm sure that, Sherene and I will go back and forth on experiences inside of the classroom. But I know for me, we all know I don't think it's any secret to anybody that's on this call today that the issue of race is one that's very prevalent and one that is very highly debated and can be very heated at times, if not all the time. And in the classroom, as we know, historically, Black and Brown individuals remain at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to oppression. And even just myself, my presence being in the classroom in and of itself is a way to combat said oppression on an academic level. But then to be in, say, a gender studies course or a feminist class or something related to feminism where they're discussing critical race theory as it relates to and pertains to the system of prostitution, it's been really, really challenging to be a survivor who's open in the community, however, may not be open in class about my survivor status, for lack of a better term, and listening to what usually is, or most of the time, a white academic trying to explain to the class that we need to view the system of prostitution in one way. And oftentimes what I have found in the 4 schools that I've been in is that teachers tend to separate the issues of race and prostitution without addressing how they are inherently connected. So one, I think that's where the first set of failures comes from, not addressing the two issues as they intersect, but more as two separate issues that need to be addressed separately. I think that is where the first set of challenges arises, because without addressing the intersection of racial inequities and prostitution and how there's gender inequity that lies there, or and inequalities there, I think that there are some false narratives that tend to come out of those said conversations. Separately, and we'll talk about this further into the conversation, but there's a huge push to fully decriminalize the sex trade where I live. And in the classrooms, a lot of the professors that I've had approach this conversation about this debate on whether to fully decriminalize or to leave criminalized or whatever have you. They approach this conversation with one particular perspective, and that is to support the legalization or full decriminalization of the sex trade. And what they do is take that, bring race into the narrative only when it's convenient to support a pro-sex work narrative, and then try to throw it under this guise of feminism. So I think that for me, my experiences have been very difficult because one, I have to combat my personal life experience versus what an academic is teaching the rest of the class, while simultaneously also having to listen to one perspective on this issue being pushed without addressing the intersections that would prove, therefore, or on the other hand, that that's actually false and that we shouldn't be looking at prostitution or the sex trade as a job or as a choice or as work, but recognizing how racial inequities, gender inequities all intersect and make it so that this shouldn't be a viable option for anybody.
Thank you. That's really powerful. Sherene or Taina?
I can go after Melanie's, very eloquent description of what happens in the classroom. I can maybe comment a little bit about what happens in the classroom when you're the prof, but also what happens in the university and in research when you are actually trying to advance a particular analytical path. And so for me, the problem started at the very beginning when it was clear that whether you understand prostitution and the sex trade as primarily about work or primarily about violence, from the very beginning, whichever side you took, one of the difficulties was that people persisted in understanding it as only about gender. And gender was abstracted from the other systems, as Melanie said. And so what happened is that, even around critical race people, if you want to use that term, if race and class entered the picture at all, it entered really as a complication. So people would say things like poor and racialized women have fewer economic alternatives to prostitution than do other women. What is missing when you take that sort of additive approach is a more structural and systemic view, which is that you don't really ask how the regulation of bodies happens in prostitution or in the sex trade. You don't really ask, you don't ever arrive at the point where you see that white supremacy, colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy are all simultaneously completely central to what happens. So right from the start, then you have to swim upstream to ask the question, what does prostitution secure? What does the sex trade do? And when you start advancing kind of methodologies or approaches to thinking about this, this is where I think I've run into all kinds of tensions and conflicts with people who are utilizing a framework that doesn't really focus on what all the three systems are doing at once, but instead abstracts it out. So in 1997, for example, when I published my first big article on this, I thought that the way to really get at all the systems was to ask questions about the John. not so much questions about the prostitute. And questions like, why is he buying sexual services? What does this act secure? What is this act? Those kinds of questions were sort of almost ruled irrelevant, and they would quickly come to be questions that people said actually trampled on the agency of the women in prostitution, because you didn't want to ask about them. And I have to admit, I was very worried. I've always been worried about what that does to my work, that I don't really ask perhaps enough questions about agency. But on the other hand, it's very clear that questions about the agency of people involved in the sex trade should not cancel out questions about what the person buying the services is doing in that situation. So for me, I think it was this problem right from the beginning of how to think systemically and structurally of all the systems. And then another sort of critical point that I want to make about this kind of experience is that I decided fairly early on that one way out of this problem of thinking of all the systems was to actually focus on hierarchical relations among women. How are the lives of women who are not prostitutes shaped by the lives of women who are? How is the white high-class call girl different from or related to the phone sex graduate student? How are all of us linked to a system where Indigenous women in prostitution end up dead a lot of the times? And how are the zones of prostitution, the iconic pretty girl kind of idea, actually related to sort of zones of prostitution in North America, but in Asia and elsewhere? So this kind of relational analysis was for me a kind of methodology for really kind of understanding what prostitution does. And what I found is that there were some really pernicious kind of responses that one got to this. And what really sort of drives me and worries me is that these responses are almost exactly the same today as they were then. For example, and this is perhaps the most pernicious example, is that there's an enduring mythology about prostitution as sexually freeing and as rebellion, feminist rebellion. And anybody who dares to think otherwise is a Victorian prude. And I got this in the early 90s, and I get this now in my classrooms. And so that really, raises, a horrific set of questions. And it really pushes us to think, like, why is this a paradigm, a set of responses that persists even when they are so clearly sort of, they're very liberal, but even when they so clearly don't include thinking about the violence. So that's really where I am, and I could talk later about how I experienced this personally, which is of course not the experience of someone who actually has endured it, but the experience of trying to talk about it is really striking.
No, and I think you raised some really powerful points, and many of which were echoed in the chat by several of our participants. And we'll drill down on some of those concepts that both of you raised. So I first want to go to Taina and talk a little bit about your experiences around these issues from academia.
So yes, I mean, Melanie and Sherene are hard acts to follow, and since I'm neither an academic or a survivor of prostitution, my contributions come from a different perspective. I'm really a women's rights advocate first and foremost, but listening to both of you, I think what we sometimes forget is that academic institutions are are steeped in our history of misogyny and colonialism. I mean, they are institutions that were created to uphold society as it is, to maintain the structures of power as they are. I mean, it was in our collective lifetimes, both women and African Americans and other minority groups, even Jews in the 30s had quotas at the University of Chicago. They were denied access to higher education. These were institutions that were to train people in perpetuating systems of supremacy, male supremacy, white supremacy, and sort of obfuscating all of the issues that critical race theorists are trying to bring forth and mainstream. So I think that's why it is so hard. It is extremely hard for us to, combat what is happening in these academic institutions. I've had the privilege of speaking before the UN in hostile environments or in other environments, controversial situations. Never, ever do I ever feel as maligned and I wouldn't say fearful, but certainly feeling enormous hostility than in classrooms. I could tell you that of all my years of speaking, the one time I felt the most threatened was in a classroom at the Columbia School of Public Health. I was like, if they let me out of this room alive, and all that because we were talking about the legal frameworks around prostitution, like what would be the best framework and how does sex trafficking operate? And I saw in the chat that there was a question about what is the difference between quote unquote sex work and sex trafficking. Sex work is not a term that I'm not going to speak on behalf of Sherene, but I certainly know Yasmin, Melanie and I do not use the term. Feminist abolitionists do not use the term because prostitution is neither sex nor work, but a system of exploitation and oppression that is steeped on other forms of systems of oppression, in which we can talk about it later. I mean, it's even in the legislative histories of prostitution laws of Canada and New Zealand, where it actually says, Black on white, that it was the European colonizers who brought prostitution to the shores. And that goes for just about every country that the Europeans have colonized. So so just to go back on the difference between, what the difference is, so to speak, between prostitution and sex trafficking, the sex trade is a multi-billion-dollar global industry. That is where sex trafficking happens. It is a very broad spectrum. It ranges from street prostitution to brothels to online exploitation, including sugar dating, phone sex, pornography. It's the ultimate commodification and dehumanization of human beings who are the most marginalized people on the planet for the profit of not only exploiters, traffickers, pimps, et cetera, but also the profit of the state. And so when you see in countries that have legalized prostitution, like the Netherlands or Germany or others, to the revenues that the sex trade brings. So this all trickles down into the classroom, right? Because how are you not going to be able to perpetuate the system of exploitation uncritically, right? Because if you criticize it, you get accused of, there are lots of ad hominem or ad feminem attacks. I don't know how one would characterize it, but that is where the rubber hits the road. And our role has been so difficult in pushing forward the conversation because it's extremely hard to change the status quo. And what gives us strength, of course, is the survivor-led movement, like Melanie and Beth and others. But I also do think that the other branch in civil society that is really key for us to reach out to and discuss solutions toward eradicating these issues that we're discussing is the medical community, because of all the harm that is done in prostitution by sex buyers, by exploiters, or by the system of prostitution itself. We have absolutely no idea about we have no data, we have no statistics, there are no medical institutions, no medical research institutions, whether it's the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, or the World Health Organization, or the National Institute of Health, that have any interest in looking at the pervasive medical, physical, psychological, psychiatric harm that is done to people who have been bought and sold and exploited in the system of prostitution. And I think once we have that data, when we'll have it, who knows? Because again, these are all institutions that want to maintain a certain structure of power and domination and control and profit making. But once we have that data, I think the average person will understand the harms of prostitution and how it's just unacceptable for any society to allow human beings to be sold on the marketplace.
Thank you all for just those powerful contributions. I think many of you alluded to, and I know participants in the chat talked about this terminology of quote unquote sex work. And one of the things that I think all of us have noted is how this language and this terminology really flourishes in academia. And very little scrutiny has been paid to that. And the origins of the terminology, when it was coined, who coined it. Many people don't understand that terminology was coined by sex industry profiteers, individuals with a stake in legitimizing and perpetuating and expanding the commercial sex industry. And language like this is very euphemistic. A lot of us talk about, and I think one of the participants in the chat talked about this. And I know many of our colleagues right now in movements, Indigenous rights activists, immigrant rights activists, labor rights activists who are working to unpack and break down some of these long-held stereotypes and tropes around the sex trade, are really trying to just expose the origins of this, for lack of a better term, whitewashed, westernized euphemisms for exploitation, for violence against women and marginalized peoples. And so, again, we can talk a little bit more about this, but I wanted to kind of shift to a natural segue, I think, and really discuss how and why we think that prostitution and the sex trade continue to escape critical race theory scrutiny, especially when we know, the origins of the sex trade in the United States, as Taina alluded to, and many of our Native sisters have said, there is no word for prostitution in many Indigenous languages throughout the world, that it was a concept that was not inherent, but it was imposed often by white settler colonialists. And so looking at some of the racialized tropes, again, in pornography, many of you will be familiar with Pornhub. Each year they release their top stats and figures for what the top search terms are. And each year, I think the top 5 to 10 terms are racialized, gendered terms that really, really highlight the misogyny, the misogynoir, and blatant racism that is just the underpinnings of sexual exploitation and the sex trade. And so I'm curious, why and how is it that sexual exploitation continues to escape this critical race lens? And why do we think this is, despite everything that we've seen and all of the attention that's being paid towards racial justice movements, elevating the power and lives of women and girls of color, Indigenous rights? Why is it that the sex trade continues to get away with perpetuating and solidifying these racialized tropes in our culture?
I wonder, Yasmin, if I could jump in to just backtrack a little bit before sort of thinking about, why critical race theorists fail to do this. And in some sense, this is so widespread. It's not a particular failing of critical race, but what I want to sort of think about is that how do people defend the argument that this is both about sex and about work? And definitely there are people interested in saying things are so bad that we have to think of better working conditions. So there might be that maybe a slightly less hostile and harmful response. But one way in which people kind of cleave to this understanding of sex work without an understanding of all the systems is that they're able in their hearts and their minds, and this really matters, they're able in their bodies to make a nice distinction between forced and free. And so they're able to say things like, oh, I know it's as bad as you say, but that's only for people who are trafficked. And other people are not. And as an activist from many years ago, Evelina Giobbi of Whisper said, what you're really saying to me is that, some of us don't do it right. And I think it's really important to think about what that explanation, that forced free distinction actually does for us emotionally, is it allows us to put the violence somewhere and we'll be all against that. And then to accept these other places. And you do get, even really sort of very well-known race scholars thinking about the fact that the violence of this kind was endemic to slavery, for example. But what has happened in prostitution is that at least you get paid for it. I think we need to think about the way in which we find little hiding places for ourselves to put our unease about what we really actually do know to be extraordinary and constitutive violence. And I've always wanted to point out, maybe this is too academic, but the argument that prostitution is not a system of organized violence and disposability, but is instead just work, that has often relied on academic research. And I've always liked sort of the critique that Margaret Baldwin and others made very early on in the 90s about what academic researchers do. They go out and they find stories of prostitution, and those that comes down to us as women who are in the sex trade say this, and there's a little less critical thinking about how we unpack narratives. But I've always liked the critique of who are these stories for? Who are these stories of freeing rebellious work? Who is that for? And Margaret Baldwin advanced the view that the story is for the John. And in these stories we actually find, as she put it, many prostitutes but very little prostitution. And the dead, the incoherent, those are her words. The people sort of not surviving this are not part of the stories. And so I really want us to think about this kind of almost, I want to say, an emotional difficulty we have with putting the violence somewhere. And it's not particular to sort of critical race people, but it is this absolute unwillingness to think about what I think, I forget who the activist is, said this a long time ago, the scholar. The question is not who works as a prostitute. The question is, why don't other women work as prostitutes? That is to say, we really have to think of what all the system is amounting to, and why it is that the violence is so intrinsic to it. And I think it escapes scrutiny, academic scrutiny, if you like, because it is so easily wedded to paradigms that make us feel better about the violence. And the main paradigm is, choice and we contract and so on. And what should really give us pause, either critical race theories or not, it should really give us pause. But this is what the law does. This is what the law uses to make the violence not violence, which is to talk about contract, to talk about choice, etc. So if we're tempted to use that kind of language to think about this, we should be aware of who we're really supporting in this endeavor, because we're really supporting courts in this endeavor.
I think that's a really powerful point. Melanie, yeah, I was going to ask, what is your reaction to that? Anything to add?
I had to jump on this. First of all, thank you for that eloquent explanation. And that's one of my favorite things to address, because even in the classrooms, what this perspective that most of my professors have tried to push is this pro-sex work narrative. And I think that you raised a brilliant point about this idea of putting the violence in one specific area. I think what we find is that when it comes to sex trafficking, when we talk about sex trafficking and those who were trafficked, majority of society agrees that that's wrong, especially if the people that are trafficked are under 18. We all are usually in a large, vast agreement that this shouldn't happen. But this idea of sex work, this term sex work, was coined to specifically mask those inherent harms that are related to prostitution. And I think it in part was created because of what you just said, right? A lot of times we want to feel better about ourselves. It's easier to think of sex work as it's being pushed to us as this autonomous and full of agency, and this idea of giving a choice to the person that's in the sex trade. It's easier to grasp onto that because it's the quote unquote happy narrative, right? This is where you feel as if you're doing something right by supporting any individual who says, this is something that I chose to do. And it's easier to say, well, she said she chose it, or they said they chose it, so that's what we're going to go with, rather than actually buckling down and analyzing the systems of oppression that make up the sex trade. Because it in part kind of absolves you from any form of guilt or any responsibility to actually think about what the harms truly look like in our local communities. And I think what I like to tell people all the time is that where the misconception with sex trafficking, sex work, where it comes in, is that a lot of people do not view the system of prostitution as a system. They view prostitution as individualized autonomous choices, which is why there's so much traction behind the sex work narrative, which is why so many professors, both in gender studies, critical race theory, whatever have you, push this to their students, because they view prostitution as an individualized choice without recognizing that colonialism, capitalism, misogyny, and patriarchy, sexism, these are the oppressive systems, racism, that all make up and fuel the sex trade, which is why the majority of individuals who are exploited in the sex trade are Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks, all inclusive of LGBTQIA plus identifying individuals. And oftentimes, because it's easier to absolve yourself from that responsibility of educating yourself of the guilt of what is happening in your backyards, we want to grasp onto the sex work narrative. But what a lot of people, I can't remember word for word what you had just said, Sherene, but you made a comment about forced versus trafficked and choice. And what a lot of people don't understand is that you cannot make a choice if you don't have choices. So oftentimes when people hear traffic, they think of movies like Taken, which is one extreme of sex trafficking. And when people think of sex work, they think of Pretty Woman, right? This happy hooker narrative where the girl is spoiled and there's this person with all these luxurious resources and vast amounts of money. But what a lot of people don't recognize is that trafficking doesn't only look like having a gun to your head or having a knife to your throat. And that's not the only way that somebody can be forced into prostitution. And I think where this conversation regarding critical race theory, the classrooms, academia, I think where it needs to shift its focus more so to have better and more I can't think of the word, but to have these types of conversations in the classroom, I think that what we're not talking enough about is this area of choice by circumstance. It's easy for us to understand not having the choice if somebody kidnaps you or throws you in a white van or has a gun to your head. But what about not having the choice because you live marginalized? What about not having the choice because you're on food stamps or your welfare doesn't cover you and your children, or because you grew up in a Black and brown community that didn't have any resources or was redlined, so therefore your children and your grandchildren do not have enough to eat. Oftentimes when you don't have those types of choices, you are also forced into the system of prostitution, because the system of prostitution that is fueled on misogyny, patriarchy, capitalism, racism, colonialism targets you specifically as a vulnerable individual in a marginalized society. So I think that what you just said was so brilliant. And I think that when we talk about the issue of choice, when we talk about sex work versus sex trafficking or prostitution, when we talk about this idea of forced prostitution versus non-forced prostitution, and when we talk about critical race theory, racism, feminism talks in the classroom, we need to address these intersectionalities, because we're looking at them different, because it's easier to just throw autonomy or agency on the entire crime and on the system, and to say, well, you know, they said it, so that's what it is, not recognizing that most of the individuals that are saying that that's what it is and that's how it should be are also marginalized folks who are also at the bottom of the barrel and a product of said oppression. So I think that we need to shift our conversation a bit to really understand what choice means, what systems of oppression make up the system of prostitution, and recognizing that prostitution thrives on systems rather than an individualized and autonomous choice.
I think that was so powerfully stated. And, you know, it brings up so many points as both of you were talking. I was just thinking of the work and statements by so many other activists and scholars across the world. And one came to mind, Sherry Smiley, who's an Indigenous rights activist and feminist from Canada. And she talked about buying into this mythology around, you know, the quote, sex work is work, and that prostitution is a job like any other. Narrative is actually quite a racist one, because it almost implies, like, that autonomy argument and that agency argument implies that all of these women of color and people, you know, marginalized people of color like it, right? It buys into those, you know, racialized, over hypersexualized tropes around women of color being more promiscuous, more, you know, like the Jezebel, like all of those very racialized mythologies about women and girls of color, because they're so overrepresented in the sex trade wherever you look across the globe, that it's almost to imply and feed into those very harmful racialized stereotypes that they're more into it. They like it more than other women. That's why they're doing it. And it absolves us of our responsibility in truly trying to improve the lives and improve conditions for all of us. And I think about, you know, one of the things that we always say as part of our work at Rights4Girls is there should be no difference between raping someone and paying to rape someone. But as Sherene was talking about, we've created through law, through policy, through history, these loopholes to justify and rationalize the way in which we treat and, you know, honestly, generations of gendered violence against women and girls of color. I mean, hearing what you were talking about, I think of Racy Taylor, right? I think of how during the Jim Crow era, right, prostitution during colonization and the slave trade used to be just the straight commodification of Black and brown women's bodies, right, as property for male profit and pleasure. And then it started to evolve, right? Prostitution became used as a means to legitimize violence against women and girls of color. You know, Racy Taylor was gang raped by 6 men and they threw money on her. And that's how they, you know, 2 separate grand juries failed to indict them. Why? Because they said, oh, it was consensual, it was prostitution. So just unpacking that, I mean, we have a responsibility as activists, as scholars, as anyone in the social justice, academic, feminist spaces to understand that history and to truly have the full picture before we come to any conclusions about, you know, what these systems are and who is caught up in them. Taina, is there anything you'd like to add on this point?
Yeah, just to answer your initial question as to why so many of our colleagues don't see it, can analyze the system of prostitution as the ultimate commodification of misogyny. It's something that haunts me. It's something that pains me that so many Black women leaders in this country have adopted this, male white supremacist vision of prostitution, this ultimate commodification of people. I don't understand the cognitive dissonance. I don't know if it comes from funding, if it comes from fear of being, chastised or being excluded from the sociopolitical circles in which they operate and on which their success relies. It's been a very, very, very difficult journey for me trying to reach out to a few of my Black sisters who are in the social justice movement and who are otherwise absolutely brilliant on issues of critical race theory and even issues of women and girls' rights. And yet they make a left turn when it comes to prostitution. It becomes an exception to gender-based violence and to sex-based violence. Prostitution, the conversations we are having around prostitution today are the same conversations we had around domestic violence and sexual violence and rape 50 years ago, where it was always victim-centered, whether or not she had a choice to leave, whether or not she had the fortune to marry a man who didn't beat her, whether she had a choice to wear a short skirt on the street or to go in his bedroom and have a drink at night. It was always her fault until 3,500 years later, we finally got our governments and our policymakers and legislators to understand that these were crimes of power and control of male violence against women, and that society needed to address it, not just from a human rights perspective and a women's rights perspective, but also as a public health perspective. And as such human rights violations actually did have severe economic costs. The reason why so many corporations embrace the concept of domestic violence, offering people counseling and time off, is because they were realizing how much money they were losing with absenteeism, with emergency room costs, et cetera. So I think that's where we are on the conversation around prostitution. And I go back to the fact that we don't have enough information. Now, having said that, we are making progress on the legal side, right? So we have strong anti-trafficking laws. Of course, they could be improved, but both at the federal level and the international level, we do have strong laws. People try to undermine them constantly. Sweden in 1999 passed a law recognizing prostitution as gender-based violence and discrimination and a barrier to gender equality, and recognizing that sex buyers are really the fuel monsters that enrich traffickers, right? So people like to bandy about numbers which are very, very, very modest as to how much the illegal profits from sex trafficking bring. So right now, the number's at 90 billion. It's probably triple or quadruple that number for reasons we can explain. But what people never say is that every single one of those $90 billion come from sex buyers. You remove the sex buyers and there would be no business of prostitution. And so 7 countries have followed Sweden that decided not to criminalize people in prostitution, but to offer them services that they need, including exit strategies, should they be willing and able to leave the sex trade, but to make accountable, hold accountable the sex buyers who are really that's where the buck stops. It's with the sex buyers, as both Melanie and Sherene mentioned. So 7 countries have followed Sweden. No countries have followed New Zealand, who went the other way to fully decriminalize the sex trade, including pimping, sex buying, brothel owning, et cetera. We know here in the US, there are many, many jurisdictions that are trying to push for full decriminalization, but there are also many jurisdictions, including in New York, that are trying to push for the Swedish, now known as the equality model. It was known as the Nordic model for many years. But again, I think going back to a failure of understanding where prostitution sits within the women's rights framework and women's equality framework, you have to go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which there are 3 elements that are key to that. And I always give room to Eleanor Roosevelt, who's the architect of the Declaration, and that's that human rights are indivisible, inalienable, and universal. And somehow those 3 concepts do not apply to women and girls. Governments divide our rights constantly, all the time. And if you look at sort of the plethora of all of the sexual violence and violence and discrimination against women and girls, whether it's girl marriage or female genital mutilation, the list goes on, prostitution, it's all the same. It's variations on the same theme. And until we understand that, yes, colonialism exacerbated violence against women by commodifying it. We know that, and prostitution again is like the utmost commodification, as is gestational surrogacy. I saw that also popped up in the chats. But misogyny existed before the Africans were trafficked here, right? So we often talk about colonialism as the source of pain and suffering for especially Black women, especially in the sex trade. But back home, there was already female genital mutilation and polygamy and girl marriage. And so again, it's the 4,000-year question as to why, if you're born a girl, why is it that you are condemned to so many human rights violations, non-state torture, or even state-sanctioned torture? I mean, now we're looking at the Taliban. So these are very, very difficult questions to unravel, and we have to go back to Professor Catherine McKinnon's book, whose title is "Are Women Human?" And I think that's a question that on which we base our work every single day.
Thank you all so much. I want to pivot quickly. I know we have a lot of questions popping up in the chat, and I want to get to Q&A, but first I wanted to ask Sherene, just in light of the research and work that you've done, if you can talk us a little bit through the gendered and racialized violence of colonization and why you think it's so critical to have this intersectional lens. I mean, I know we've talked a lot about it, but I think just explicitly connecting the dots to these issues through colonization and settler colonialism is incredibly important.
I think the one useful way to begin to think about this is to think about the fact that, think about what happens in prostitution itself, and how do we understand this kind of sexualized violence. And one approach that I took early on, which I think still yields something, but has troubles, is to think about what brings the woman. In this article that I wrote, it was about an Indigenous woman, Pamela George, a Soto woman, who is working in prostitution and ends up dead. And the question is, what brought her to that encounter that night? That's easy enough to answer, and you find colonialism there full on, right? She's there because her community has been absolutely impoverished. They have to go to the city to get work. There's no other work for Indigenous women other than to engage in prostitution. So it's easy enough to trace the colonial path. But what is the colonial path for what brings the men there? What brought her killers to that encounter? Where's colonialism there? And I think in that situation, you end up with what is actually happening is imprinting power, colonial white power in this case, directly on the body of an Indigenous woman. And so I feel like tracing the coloniality of the event is easy when you actually ask those kinds of questions of what brings both parties to that encounter. But another part where the colonial aspect is so critical is exactly the same as thinking about why the transatlantic slave trade introduces a different understanding of this. What kind of a space is it where a class of persons or a group of persons can be bought for brutalizing, for the express purpose of brutalizing? And then when you have those classes of people, how much force is too much force? And this is what you find in the law when you're looking at sort of cases, trials of people, of men who've murdered an Indigenous woman in the context of prostitution. The court is always asking this question. The assumption is that force is what's the name of the game, that's what's happening here. And the question is, how much force is too much force? And do you know what? That was the question. Saidiya Hartman has written so beautifully about this. That was the question about sexual services in the slave contract. How, in the context of a slave contract, would you actually tell how much force is too much force? You know, how would you draw that line? And I think when we think about that, about the existence of such spaces, actual concrete material spaces where this can go on, and then we think about spaces in law where this is actually sanctioned and allowed, because how much force is too much force when you have this kind of situation? I think when we think about that, we really understand that it is impossible to consider the violence and how to end it without considering the creation of these spaces and what happens in them. Men or Johns generally are able to be colonizers, to go anywhere and do anything that they want for that moment of the contract. And we need to think about it like that. That is an affirmation of a particular colonial white or white aspiring masculinity that is achieved through violence. It's that wonderful phrase by Richard Slotkin on his first book. This is how men colonizers regenerate. They regenerate through violence. And so it's really critical for us to think about this space that is created and maintained for this regeneration to take place.
No, I think that's absolutely critical, and it informs so much of what we see today. I think, you know, many of us here, I know Melanie, Taina, and I, we've all tried to spread awareness around how these legacies of colonization are with us, that you can't just ignore the fact that it was normalized and sanctioned and really, you know, entrenched into the culture of this country for white men to readily access the bodies of, you know, Black and brown and Indigenous women and children. And so, you know, it helps inform so much of what we see. I mean, I'm going to put a fact sheet into the chat that we've compiled. I mean, it should be no surprise that women and girls of color continue to be overrepresented, whether we're talking about child sex trafficking victims, whether we're talking about sex trade survivors, while white men are glaringly overrepresented among sex buyers. And I think having that historical lens and context helps to explain so much of the dynamics of what we see today in terms of the system of prostitution. I want to give each of you a chance to respond to Sherene's comments before turning to Mel. Do you have anything to add?
No, I think she set that up perfect.
So Melanie, I'm curious, as an activist who works not just in the movement to end sexual exploitation and trafficking, you've worked across multiple movements, racial justice, civil rights, LGBTQ rights. what do you wish that other social justice movements could understand about the importance of, incorporating this anti-exploitation lens into their work? I mean, is it frustrating? How do you find when you come into these other movements and you show up repeatedly to elevate these other causes, but they don't always seem to understand, align, and oftentimes completely counter your stance on the issue of prostitution?
It is very frustrating. I think for me, what I want to see in other movements is for them to see how a lot of our movements all intersect with each other. And I think that what I find is that so many of these different movements all operate individually and don't address those intersectionalities. And I think that's why we're always left in the dark, I feel. Even with the Me Too movement, that was something that I showed up for, supported, like most of our society at that time. And I think somebody had referenced this in the chat, but it always felt as if, I always say to people, when the college student came and threw her mattress overboard and said that she was raped, everybody supported that. But when a prostitution survivor came and said that they were raped, but that person left $100 on the dresser, they didn't support that. That was all consensual. And I think that what I would like to see is for the movements to address the intersectionalities, but also to understand why prostitution specifically as a topic is one that it always has a different stance or some type of debate on. I want people to really analyze and dig a little bit deeper than the surface and recognize what oppressive systems are rooted in prostitution, or shall I say prostitution is rooted in, and really recognizing how misogyny, how patriarchy, how capitalism is what fuels the sex trade, and recognizing that the reason why there's such heavy debate and why so many people turn a blind eye is because of those systems, right? The people that you would be going against if you took a stance against prostitution are the people that benefit the most, but also people that hold higher positions in society, have a bigger influence. And I think oftentimes it's easier to, I guess for lack of a better term, it's easier to fight on those said issues, but not this one, because you are afraid of confronting or addressing or combating these individuals or these systems or groups of people that have this higher influence. So I really want people to look at how we're all connected, recognize that these social justice issues are not one in and of themselves. They are connected and inherently intersectional. And I want people to really not be afraid to address these systems of oppression and recognize that although they may be high players and historically may have held higher impacts in society for a long time, it can change.
Thank you. So I want to, our last question before we turn it over to the Q&A is, what is our path forward, and what is the hope for the future? I know many of us are really active in this space and have seen just some brilliant young feminists and scholars and survivor leadership coming out. I know one activist just shared an excellent piece by a survivor, Esperanza Fonseca, who's just been writing brilliantly about these issues. She's a trans sex trade survivor who's just has like an amazing analysis when it comes to these issues. And there's so many organizations now, Indigenous rights activists, labor rights activists, immigrant rights activists, LGBTQ rights activists, really starting to come forward and connect these dots and really have more of a critical analysis, especially in the younger generation. So I'm curious, what is our hope? Where do we go from here? And are we hopeful?
We wouldn't do this work if we weren't hopeful. Just in our lifetimes, even Melanie, who's barely 25, she's seen tremendous progress in her lifetime. It's tough because obviously, part of our work is also following the money, so you can deconstruct what is happening and who are the power brokers behind all of this resistance toward justice and equality, because there is monetized resistance. As I mentioned, it's not just academic institutions that were shaped with the supremacies that we like to highlight, but there are also philanthropy, number one. and also government and their representatives. So what gives me hope is that we have to remember that if the suffragists counted on most women to work toward the vote, we still would not be able to vote, right? It took the work of a very small but committed group of fierce activists, and you can apply that to a number of other movements. You know, Sojourner Truth famously said, when asked how many slaves did she rescue, she said 1,000, and I would have saved 1,000 more had they known they were slaves. And I think that is very, very profound. We, as a culture, we don't know that we are perpetuating these unbelievably harmful systems to our mental health, because here we're talking about obviously the harms of prostitution that is done to people who are bought and sold in it by men. And again, 99.9% of sex buyers are men. But what we don't really look at, I mean, there's some emerging research on the harms of pornography on children and what addiction can do to human beings, especially young men. But this is really, it's not sustainable. This perpetuation of ultimate commodification of human beings on a marketplace is not sustainable. And I think that is what gives me some hope. Of course, what keeps me up at night is the hundreds and thousands of people who will suffer until people see the light and recognize that the system of prostitution is a system of capitalist hate against the most marginalized people. But I think we will get there. And the average person on the street, I mean, we're very enmeshed in this ideological warfare. I mean, we know it's a bloody, bloody war, but the person on the street will understand. And I always say, if a Martian came down to Earth, and we gave it just a snapshot of what the sex trade is, and on one hand, you're going to see 99.9% men, and on the other, you're going to see globally 96% women and girls, mostly of color, plus trans individuals and boys and gender nonconforming people. They can say, oh, I get it. We're talking about gender-based violence and discrimination, and where does this come from? And I think that is the question that we need to ask ourselves, is where does it come from, and how can we unravel all of these? They're not so complicated, right? It's just we make it more complicated than it is. And I think our responsibility is to make it clear that this needs to end at a very, very, very urgent pace.
Thank you. Anyone else? What are your thoughts? Where do we go from here? What is your hope, or what is what makes you hopeful about where we go from here?
I'm glad that Taina mentioned that you can't really do anything if you're without hope. So for me, it's not really a question of being hopeful or being in despair, because I just don't think I can afford to be in despair. But I do think that the direction that we might see more light coming from that direction is exactly what Melanie mentioned, which is that if we understand these struggles as so interconnected and intrinsic to each other, that we will come closer to confronting the violence. And so for me, if we understand prostitution as an organized disposability, then we might be able, for instance, to draw on all the strength of Black Lives Matter, for instance, in confronting the structural and the systemic and the way in which the prison has replaced the plantation, for example. Well, if we connected If we understood that prostitution, is the system that sort of binds it all in different ways, then that opens the way forward for a politics that is really abolitionist, that is really around how do we confront these systems, these multiple systems of organized disposability. So I don't know that hope is the word that I would use, but I certainly see that that's where I get any kind of encouragement to go forward.
Thank you. Mel, any thoughts?
I have hope. I do think that I think that we made a lot of progress when it comes to this issue, just talking about it and having more circles where whether it ends up being a debate or whether it ends up being a really cohesive conversation. I think that from when I started in my little life, I've seen a lot more of these circles come up, and I think that that's great. But I also think that we have a very long way to go. And I do believe that it may or may not be solved in my lifetime, but I am hopeful that eventually society will see the harms and the harsh realities for what they are. I am hopeful that in the classroom settings and in academia, there will be a shift when it comes to this issue and the issue and all the issues that intersect with this issue, and that conversations in the classrooms will be different. And I am hopeful that we can build more of a communal unity when it comes to the issue of prostitution and really just understanding the lives of survivors.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much. I want to thank our panelists. I think we have time for maybe just a couple questions before closing out in about 10 minutes. So one question that came up that I think is important to raise, and I know there were some responses in the chat, came from one participant that said, what about male prostitution? Much of what we've focused on today was about women, but what about men and boys in prostitution? Does anyone want to talk about that?
Well, the are men, right? So we're still talking about gender inequality, and very often it's men who are feminized, and trans women and trans youth, especially of color, are also at high risk of exploitation and being bought and sold by sex buyers, mostly white, who have a particular preference for that population. So again, I think what we were all trying to say is it's a system. It's not an individual act. It's not whether or not the person is male or female or trans or 18 or trafficked or not. It is a system, and our responsibility is to look at all the actors and elements that contribute to the system for profit. And again, we're not just talking about the profit of traffickers and brothel managers, we're also talking about the profits that go to the state. And the state has enormous responsibility. So I see in the chat, people are just a little sort of, they have questions about who we represent, et cetera. And again, I speak because I speak of the state because that's who we try to get to pass policies and laws. But let's say there's someone who cannot leave an intimate partner, violent relationship for whatever reason, whether it's emotionally, culturally, religious, whatever. The state would not decriminalize domestic violence. No, we offer that person support. We tell that person that we are here for that person, that we understand the conditions under which that person is being hurt and harmed. But the state we have a responsibility as a community to look at collective rights and to look at the harms and avoid the harms. And it goes from seatbelts on. So I don't know why there would be an exception for the system of prostitution.
One other comment that just came in that I think is powerful, and it goes back to a comment you made, Sherene, about the prison replaced the plantation. And this participant talks about how it's often we neglect, and I'll kind of add to that because I know we've talked about this in some of our past sessions here as a part of our virtual series. And I know Melanie and I think, have done a couple of other webinars around this notion of prison and police abolition, and how so much of that philosophy is rooted in this belief of abolishing, these remnants of slavery and these racist, violent systems of oppression. And there's so much focus on the police and prisons, but as this participant is noting, and what we have often said is, we fail to recognize that prostitution is that remnant of slavery, is that remnant of commodification and oppression for women and girls of color, particularly Black women, Indigenous women, and girls. And so we often forget that that is almost the feminized counterpart to what the prison system has been. And so it's very interesting. And I think, we've talked a lot about this, and it's something I know we'll continue to explore, about how the movements for prison abolition are oftentimes complementary to these moments for sex trade abolition, right? We're talking about abolishing all oppressive systems. So I wonder if any of you have thoughts or comments on that point, which I think is a very powerful one, and one that, as people who work across multiple social justice movements, should be highlighted.
Just a quick point to say that abolitionists run all the time into this absolute failure to imagine a world, for example, without prisons or without policing. And it strikes me that that is what is operating a lot of the time when we want to talk about the abolition of the global sex trade, or sex trade in general, if you want to call it that. I think that we run into that sort of, it's a failure of the imagination to imagine a world without this, is what we confront. And it's really difficult to imagine something that is so damn profitable, and that is in some ways the kind of glue that keeps the system together, like prisons are. So I think, but maybe paradoxically, it's just because we share that across sort of various abolitionist movements that might prove to be the way forward.
I think that's a brilliant place for us to end too, because I think, I'm reminded of a convening that I was in recently, because, we work in some of these spaces, and this exact point came up. And one of the young women who was in the session said, I truly, if I'm going to be honest, I have a lot easier time imagining a world without prisons than imagining a world without prostitution. And I think that inevitability, right, of violence against women, of the system of prostitution, again, all of these, colonial tropes of like the oldest profession, even though these are, again, talking points from, the 19th and 20th century, we really just do and have to be more aspirational. And if we are going to be so aspirational as to imagine a world without prisons, without, racism and misogyny, maybe would be so aspirational as to imagine a world without the system of prostitution, where, we can have true freedom, true liberation, and equality for all people. So I just want to thank you to our panelists, thank you to our participants for joining, and for the rich conversation that was happening in the chat. I just want to remind you all that participants will be sent a link to this discussion. It will also be archived on Repair's YouTube channel. And we want to invite you to continue following our series. We have several more exciting conversations around some of these emerging issues coming up. And so with that, I just want to thank all of you. I want to thank our co-sponsors, Repair and Beth in particular. It's been a real pleasure being with you today. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.